The night shift at Hargrove Manufacturing was always monotonous. Claire Stevens had taken the job to save money for her upcoming wedding, but the endless hours alone in the sprawling industrial complex quickly began to wear on her. The factory's echoing halls, filled with looming machines and blinking control panels, seemed to hum with a life of their own at night. On her first night, Claire had felt uneasy as she settled into the dimly lit security booth. The cameras flickered between empty break rooms, silent assembly lines, and the desolate parking lot. "It's just me and the machines," she murmured, attempting to reassure herself. However, by the second week, Claire started noticing subtle oddities. A toolbox that had been left by the conveyor belt one moment was suddenly on the floor in the next camera frame. A chair in the employee lounge appeared to move slightly. It was all too small to be alarming, but it left her with an inexplicable sense of unease. One night, as Claire performed her rounds, she thought she heard a faint tapping noise. She froze, her flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the factory floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the cavernous space. No answer. She shook her head and continued, telling herself it was the wind or a loose part of a machine. But the tapping didn't stop. A week later, Claire's unease had turned into full-blown dread. The tapping had evolved into louder rhythmic bangs, always coming from a different part of the building. She reported it to her manager, who dismissed it as pipes expanding and contracting. One night, as she reviewed the surveillance feeds, her stomach dropped. On the camera focused on the assembly line, a shadow moved. Not a blur, not a flicker. A distinct humanoid shadow darted between the machines. Claire stared at the screen, her breath shallow. She rewound the footage. There it was again. The figure moved too quickly to make out details, but it was undeniably there. Grabbing her flashlight and radio, Claire hesitated before leaving the safety of the booth. "This is crazy," she whispered. But the nagging need to prove she wasn't imagining things drove her forward. She moved cautiously through the factory, the beam of her flashlight trembling as she checked every corner. When she reached the assembly line, she found nothing but silence and shadows. Yet, as she turned to leave, her flashlight caught something, a set of muddy footprints leading into the storage room. The storage room was one of the creepiest parts of the factory, crammed with towering shelves of outdated equipment and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Claire's heart pounded as she followed the footprints, which disappeared halfway across the room. Suddenly, the bulb went out, plunging the space into darkness. Claire fumbled for her flashlight, but before she could turn it on, a faint whisper filled the air. It was a man's voice, low and guttural. "You shouldn't be here." Claire spun around, her flashlight flickering to life, but the room was empty. Panic surged through her as she sprinted back to the security booth. Locking the door, she tried to calm her racing heart, but the whisper seemed to follow her, echoing faintly in her ears. The next night, Claire almost called in sick, but she couldn't afford to lose the paycheck. Determined to power through, she kept her eyes glued to the monitors, determined to catch another glimpse of the shadowy figure. Around 2 a.m., the cameras began to glitch. The feed crackled and distorted, showing static interspersed with fleeting images of the factory floor. Suddenly, one camera feed froze. A live image of the storage room door, which was slightly ajar. Claire's pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. Slowly, the door creaked open further, and a figure stepped into view. It was a man, his face obscured by shadows, wearing ragged clothes smeared with grime. He stared directly into the camera as if he knew Claire was watching. Then he smiled. Claire grabbed her phone to call the police, but before she could dial, the lights in the booth went out. The air grew heavy, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The radio crackled to life, and a distorted voice spoke, "You can't escape." Panicking, Claire grabbed her flashlight and bolted out of the booth. She headed for the main exit, but as she ran, she realized the layout of the factory seemed to shift. Doors led to different hallways, and staircases spiraled endlessly upward. "Help!" she screamed, her voice echoing back mockingly. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the factory completely deserted. Claire was nowhere to be found, but her flashlight lay abandoned near the storage room. A review of the surveillance footage revealed something chilling. At 2:03 a.m., the camera feeds distorted. When they cleared, Claire was seen standing in the center of the assembly line, staring blankly into the camera. She raised a hand and waved slowly before the screen went black. The factory was shut down permanently after that night. Rumors spread of a ghostly figure haunting its halls, a shadowy man who whispered warnings to those who dared to work alone. Would you like me to continue with the next story? Marcus Grant was used to working night shifts. As an IT technician for a large corporate firm, he often found himself in empty offices fixing systems and troubleshooting server issues. When his company received a contract to handle the night operations for an abandoned research facility turned office building, Marcus was assigned to oversee the job. At first glance, the facility looked ordinary. A massive structure on the outskirts of town, it had once been a government lab, now converted into a sleek corporate space. But as Marcus stepped inside on his first night, the air felt thick with an unsettling stillness. Just another night, he muttered, setting his tools down in the server room. The server room was a maze of machines humming with energy, but the building itself was eerily silent. As Marcus began running diagnostics, the occasional flicker of lights caught his attention. Old wiring, he thought, dismissing it. Around midnight, Marcus encountered his first challenge. The mainframe began throwing error messages that didn't make sense. Lines of code appeared on the screen, but they weren't part of any program he recognized. What struck him as odd was that the code seemed to form words. Leave now. Marcus blinked at the screen, his mind racing. Is this some kind of prank? He wondered aloud. He tried to override the system, but the same message appeared again, followed by a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. As he turned to check the wiring, Marcus felt the temperature drop. His breath fogged the air, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Deciding to take a break, Marcus walked to the break room to grab a coffee. As he reached the room, he stopped in his tracks. The door was ajar, and the light flickered sporadically. Inside, he found his toolbox open and scattered across the floor. What the hell? He muttered, kneeling to gather his tools. But as he picked them up, he noticed something unsettling. The tools were ice cold to the touch, as if they'd been left in a freezer. He stood and scanned the room, feeling as if he was being watched. The silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the faint creak of a floorboard behind him. Marcus spun around, but no one was there. By 2 a.m., Marcus decided to check the surveillance cameras. As he scrolled through the feeds, his heart skipped a beat. One camera, positioned in a corridor near the research wing, showed a figure standing motionless in the shadows. The figure was tall and gaunt, with a face obscured by darkness. Marcus watched as it slowly turned and began walking toward the server room. He scrambled to lock the server room door, his hand shaking as he engaged the electronic lock. But the moment he secured it, a knock echoed from the other side. "Who's there?" Marcus shouted, his voice trembling. A faint, hollow voice replied. "Why are you here?" Marcus backed away from the door, his mind racing. He reached for his phone to call for help, but the screen was frozen, displaying the same error message as the server. "Leave now." The knocking stopped abruptly, and the room fell into an oppressive silence. Marcus listened, his breath shallow, until he heard the sound of footsteps moving away. Reluctantly, he opened the door and peered into the corridor. It was empty, but a faint trail of wet footprints led away toward the research wing. Against his better judgment, Marcus followed them, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. The footprints ended abruptly in front of a locked door labeled Lab 4. As Marcus stared at the door, it creaked open, revealing a darkened room filled with overturned furniture and shattered glass. Inside the lab, Marcus saw an old workstation flickering to life. The monitor displayed a grainy black and white video feed of the very room he was standing in. He watched as a figure emerged from the shadows on the screen, slowly walking toward the camera. Panicking, Marcus spun around but found the room empty. His flashlight beam trembled as he scanned the space, his heart pounding. The voice returned, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the workstation shut off, plunging the lab into darkness. Marcus bolted for the exit, sprinting down the corridors with the sound of heavy footsteps chasing him. He didn't dare look back. When he reached the parking lot, he didn't stop until he was in his car, driving away as fast as he could. The next morning, Marcus quit the assignment, refusing to explain why. He later learned that the research facility had been shut down years ago after an experiment went horribly wrong, resulting in several deaths. The company never sent another technician to work the night shift. The building remains abandoned, but locals claim to hear strange noises and see lights flickering in the windows at night. Would you like me to continue with the third story? Emma Rivera, a freshly hired night nurse, was thrilled about her new job at Ridgewood Memorial Hospital. With its impressive pay and steady hours, it seemed like a dream opportunity. However, there was one catch. She was assigned to Ward 6, the oldest wing of the hospital, which had been partially closed for years. Not much traffic there, her supervisor had explained, brushing off her concerns. But we need someone to keep an eye on it during the night shift, just routine rounds. Emma wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but the moment she stepped into Ward 6, she couldn't ignore the eerie atmosphere. The air was cold, the lights dim, and the faint scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the stillness. She set up her station at the nurse's desk, the glow of her computer screen her only company. The quiet hours stretched ahead, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. By midnight, Emma began to feel the weight of her solitude. To pass the time, she scrolled through patient files. Most of them were from years ago, detailing cases of terminal illnesses, mysterious infections, and a particularly disturbing account of an experimental drug trial that had been abruptly halted. As she read, her monitor flickered, distorting the screen. For a brief second, she thought she saw a face, pale, gaunt, and staring directly at her. She gasped, pushing her chair back. "Just a glitch," she whispered, her voice trembling. But then she noticed something on the desk, a set of patient charts that hadn't been there earlier. The top chart bore the name Michael Hensley. Flipping it open, she saw that it belonged to a patient who had died in the hospital years ago. Shaking off her unease, Emma decided to make her rounds. Armed with a flashlight, she ventured into the dimly lit hallways of Ward 6. The rooms were empty, the beds neatly made, but the oppressive silence made her skin crawl. As she turned a corner, she froze. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. No one was there. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing eerily. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Emma's pulse quickened as she backed toward the nurse's desk, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Emma's fear mounted as she returned to her station. She stared at the patient charts, now spread out across the desk. Every name belonged to someone who had passed away in Ward 6. Desperate for answers, she called security, but her radio only emitted static. Frustrated, she decided to check the surveillance cameras. On the monitor, she noticed one room, room 612, had its door wide open, despite being locked earlier. Cursing under her breath, Emma grabbed her keys and headed for the room. When she arrived, the door was ajar, swinging slightly as if inviting her in. Inside, the air was frigid. The bed was unmade and the window blinds fluttered, though there was no draft. On the wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "Help me." Emma's hands trembled as she backed out of the room, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The lights flickered violently and a shadowy figure began to take shape in the corner of the room. It was the same face she had seen on her monitor, Michael Hensley. His eyes were hollow, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He pointed at her, his mouth moving soundlessly. Suddenly, Emma felt a searing pain in her chest, as if something was trying to pull her toward him. She screamed, collapsing to the floor, and the room went dark. When the lights returned, the figure was gone and the door was wide open. Emma stumbled back to the nurse's desk, her chest heaving with terror. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma dug into the hospital's archives the next day. What she found chilled her to the bone. Years ago, a drug trial in Ward 6 had gone catastrophically wrong, resulting in several patient deaths. Michael Hensley had been one of the trial subjects, and his death was listed as unexplained. Rumors of strange occurrences and apparitions had plagued the ward ever since. Emma quit her job that evening, vowing never to set foot in Ridgewood Memorial again. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's spirit, and the spirits of others like him, remained trapped, crying out for justice in the cold, empty halls of Ward 6. The hospital continues to operate, though no one willingly takes the night shift in Ward 6. Some say if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint whispers of the lost, echoing through the dark.